Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corn. So we've had some good episodes about Jerusalem lately. In fact, excellent episodes. We talked about the real pragmatic day-to-day issues for affecting the city, namely the habitability, its implementation of urbanism. We learned about how Vienna provides a very interesting counterpoint to many of the persistent issues I described as a long-term accidental resident of Jerusalem. Now, I use that term advisedly because I never actually really planned to live here. The whole story of how I came to the city is one of bureaucratic confusion. When I went to the Jewish agency way back and they told me what my options were, they neglected to mention an Ulpan in Tel Aviv, and thus I began my journey in Jerusalem, then met a great woman who became my wife and who is very, very passionate about Jerusalem, much more so than I am. And I guess life took its, that's how one thing leads to the other. Now I'm recording this from Jerusalem. One thing that we see in Jerusalem that the city is well known for is something called Jerusalem syndrome. And this is a psychiatric phenomenon by which people believe traditionally that they are some kind of reincarnation. They might think that they're the Messiah or they're living in biblical times, and it's not something that you see as much as you would think, in terms of it's kind of one of those things that has taken on internet celebrity because it's so colorful. But I have seen a few cases, what are probably a few cases of it over the years, where you see someone roaming through downtown in what looks like an attempt at recreating the dress of the biblical period, shouting, and I guess at some point the police usually intervene if they're threatening, but not always. And so I have seen a couple of cases, but it's actually not an everyday sight as you might imagine it to be. But it's certainly an interesting thing. I guess what really interests me about the whole concept of Jerusalem syndrome is a friend just posted very eloquently on Facebook, quoting from Montefiore, whose book is, as I mentioned, a tour de force about Jerusalem. And he describes it as a syndrome born out of disappointment between the mental image of the grandness of Jerusalem of old times and the maybe much grittier modern city that they encounter. And it's almost like that kind of cognitive gulf between the imagination and reality that impedes them or forces them to take up the role of a biblical figure urging divine intervention to rectify matters. But that's just one author's sentiment on the matter. I guess what I'm curious about is if we look at Jerusalem syndrome through that prism, it makes me wonder why we don't see that same syndrome in other cities, because you might have, for example, Rome, right, a very, very major significant city in the ancient world, and you don't hear Rome syndrome or Athens syndrome as much as you do Jerusalem syndrome. The other thing that it's typically associated as a tourist issue, by which it's usually tourists who seem to develop this, but I'm wondering if there have been cases where local Jerusalemites who have been living here maybe for some time actually develop the syndrome, and if it's exclusively people who have a psychiatric background, because the typical course is that these individuals are hospitalized, inpatient psychiatric care, treated. I presume that Israel has developed significant institutional expertise at treating this particular illness, but I always wonder whether it's people who maybe had a predisposition or maybe treated a case of some mental disorder with the potential for psychosis or psychosis being part of it, like schizophrenia, bipolar maybe, etc. Or if it sometimes happens to just ordinary run-of-the-mill people who didn't have any religious fervor. And that's the final question I'd like to ask here, because it's often a religious condition. Is it people who were deeply religious typically who contract Jerusalem syndrome? And finally, sorry, Herman and Corn, I'm question squishing regarding treatment. So, what happens when people think that they're Jesus or King David? They start ranting on the street, and the people might initially think they're preachers, which is an interesting topic in itself. Israel's it's quite strict laws against that, or against attempts at conversion, proselytization, and then people realize, no, this person actually thinks that they are, King David, and maybe the authorities quickly make the connection and say this is a case of Jerusalem syndrome. Person gets wheeled off to hospital. What happens after that behind closed doors? Is it antipsychotics? How does the person recover from Jerusalem syndrome and go back to living their more mundane life where they aren't King David? They just work at an insurance company or something, So Herman and Corn, let's talk about the fascinating case of Jerusalem syndrome, how it works in practice, and how many people actually get this condition that comes from the cognitive interesting case. Over to you two.
Have you ever felt like a place was just too much? Like the history, the gravity, the sheer weight of everything that happened there was pressing down on you?
Herman Poppleberry here, and let me tell you, that is basically the job description for living in Jerusalem. But for some people, it goes way beyond just feeling a bit overwhelmed. It turns into something much more intense, something that actually changes who they think they are.
We are diving into a topic that hits very close to home today. Our housemate Daniel was asking us about Jerusalem syndrome. It is this fascinating, slightly terrifying psychiatric phenomenon where visitors, and sometimes locals, suddenly believe they are figures from the Bible, or even the Messiah himself.
It is one of those things that has become internet famous, as Daniel mentioned, because it sounds so cinematic. You imagine someone in a white sheet standing on a street corner in the old city shouting prophecies. And while that does happen, the reality behind it is a lot more complex and, honestly, a lot more revealing about how our brains process sacred spaces.
It is amazing that we are at episode 495, and we have not done a deep dive on this yet, especially since we see the environment that triggers it every single day. I want to start with the big question Daniel raised. Why Jerusalem? Why not Rome? Why not Athens? Those cities are ancient. They are full of ruins and massive historical weight. Why does Jerusalem have its own specific syndrome, while Rome just has really good basta and a lot of statues?
That is such a sharp distinction. And there is actually a psychological framework for this. If you look at Rome, the history there is largely imperial and architectural. You feel small because of the scale of the empire. But Jerusalem is different because it is a city of narrative and prophecy. For billions of people, Jerusalem is not just a place on a map, it is the stage for the end of the world. It is where the most important stories in their lives are supposed to reach a climax.
So you are saying it is the difference between an imperial city and a prophetic city. In Rome, you are a spectator to history. In Jerusalem, you feel like you are a participant in a cosmic drama.
Exactly. There is this concept of the celestial Jerusalem versus the terrestrial Jerusalem. People spend their whole lives studying the celestial version, the one in the scriptures, the one that is perfect and holy. Then they get off a plane, they take a bus up the hills, and they encounter the terrestrial Jerusalem. It is crowded, it is noisy, it is dusty, and there is a lot of political tension. For some people, that gap between the two is just too wide to bridge. Their brain tries to resolve the tension by forcing the reality to match the myth, and they step into the role of a character from that myth.
That connects perfectly to that Montefiore quote Daniel mentioned. Simon Sebag Montefiore wrote this incredible biography of the city, and he talks about Jerusalem syndrome being born out of disappointment. I find that so counterintuitive. You would think it comes from being too impressed, but he argues it is the cognitive dissonance. You expect to see King David playing a harp on a hill, and instead, you see a guy selling overpriced postcards and a traffic jam on Jaffa Road.
Right. And your brain basically says, if the city will not be holy on its own, I will make it holy. I will be the prophet this city needs. It is a defense mechanism against the mundane reality of a modern city.
But let us look at the data, Herman. Is this just something that happens to anyone who forgets their sun hat and spends too much time at the Western Wall? Because Daniel asked if you need a prior history of mental illness.
This is where the research from the late Dr. Yair Bar-El comes in. He was the director of Kfar Shayul Mental Health Center here in Jerusalem for years, and he is the one who really categorized this in a famous study published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. He broke it down into 3 distinct types, and that is the key to answering Daniel's question.
Okay, walk me through the types. I am guessing type 1 is the most common?
Type 1 is basically Jerusalem syndrome superimposed on a previous psychotic illness. These are people who already have a diagnosis, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They might have already believed they were a prophet back in London or New York, and they traveled to Jerusalem specifically because that is where a prophet is supposed to be. For them, Jerusalem is the destination, not the cause.
That makes sense. It is like a magnet for people who are already struggling with their sense of reality. What about type 2?
Type 2 is more about groups. Think of cults or people with very intense idiosyncratic religious beliefs. They might not have a clinical diagnosis of mental illness, but they are part of a subculture that is obsessed with the end times or specific biblical prophecies. They arrive in Jerusalem as a group, and the collective energy of the city triggers a sort of group hysteria. It is less about an individual identity shift and more about a collective mission.
But type 3 is the one that really captures the imagination, right? The pure Jerusalem syndrome.
Yes, type 3 is the white whale of psychiatry. These are people with no prior history of mental illness. They are stable, they have jobs, they have families. They arrive as normal tourists, and within 2 or 3 days they have a complete psychotic break. It is temporary, but it is intense.
That is the part that is truly terrifying. The idea that a perfectly healthy person can just snap because of the atmosphere of a city. How many people are we actually talking about here? Is it a massive public health crisis?
Not at all. And this is where we need to be careful with the internet fame Daniel mentioned. The actual number of type 3 cases is incredibly small. In Bar-El's original 13-year study, out of over 1,200 tourists referred to the clinic, only 42 met the criteria for type 3. That is an average of only about 3 or 4 people per year. Out of millions of tourists, that is a tiny fraction. But because the symptoms are so colorful, they get all the headlines.
What does it actually look like when it starts? If I am walking around the old city with a friend, what are the red flags?
It usually follows a very specific 7-step progression. It starts with anxiety and agitation. The person might start wanting to go off on their own, away from their tour group or family. Then they get an obsession with purity. They might start washing themselves obsessively or cutting their nails and hair in a ritualistic way.
Like a ritual cleansing.
Exactly. Step 4 is the robe. This is the classic symptom. They will take the white linens from their hotel room, often a bedsheet or a towel, and fashion it into a toga-like garment. It has to be white. It has to look biblical. After the costume change, they usually start singing hymns or shouting Bible verses. Step 6 is a trek to one of the holy sites, like the Western Wall or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the final step is delivering a sermon.
It is interesting that the messages are almost always positive, or at least morally urgent. You do not hear many people getting Jerusalem syndrome and preaching about, I do not know, lower taxes or better urban planning. It is always the big cosmic stuff.
Well, if you think you are John the Baptist, you are probably not going to worry about the bus schedule. But to Daniel's point about whether it affects locals, the answer is yes, but differently. Locals almost always fall into type 1. They live here, so the shock of the city is not there for them. If a local starts believing they are King David, it is usually part of a long-term chronic condition. The sudden onset, type 3, is almost exclusively a tourist phenomenon.
Why is that? Is it just the lack of familiarity?
It is the pilgrim's journey aspect. If you live here, Jerusalem is where you buy your groceries and pay your bills. It is demystified. But if you have spent your whole life dreaming of this place, the psychological pressure of finally being here is immense. It is like a spring that has been wound up for 40 years and finally snaps when you see the Golden Gate.
I wonder if there is a biological component to this too. You have the heat, the dehydration, the jet lag, and the intense emotional stress of a pilgrimage. That is a perfect storm for a temporary psychotic break. We have talked about how the brain handles stress in past episodes, and this seems like an extreme version of that.
Absolutely. There is a reason it often happens on the third or fourth day of a trip. That is usually when the physical exhaustion of travel hits its peak. Your prefrontal cortex is tired, your defenses are down, and suddenly the celestial Jerusalem starts looking a lot more real than the actual street you are standing on.
I want to go back to the comparison with other cities. Daniel mentioned Rome and Athens. There is actually something called Stendhal syndrome, which is associated with Florence. People get overwhelmed by the beauty of the art and faint or have hallucinations. And then there is Paris syndrome, which famously affects Japanese tourists, who are so disappointed that Paris is not the romantic fairy tale they imagine that they have a breakdown.
Those are great parallels. But Jerusalem syndrome is unique because of the identity shift. In Florence, you are overwhelmed by the art out there. In Jerusalem, the madness is in here. You do not just look at the art, you become the art. You become the figure. It is an internalizing of the city's history.
It is also worth noting that it is not just Christians who get this. It affects Jews and Muslims too, though the characters they adopt are different. A Jewish person might believe they are the prophet Elijah or the Messiah. A Muslim visitor might believe they are a figure from Islamic eschatology. The syndrome is culturally sensitive. Your brain picks the hero that fits your own tradition.
That is a crucial point. It proves that this is not some magic in the air. It is a reaction between a specific brain and a specific cultural environment. If you took someone who had never heard of the Bible and put them in Jerusalem, they would probably just think it is a crowded, interesting old city. They would not start wearing a bedsheet. You need the narrative software pre-installed for the city to trigger the bug.
So, what happens when the police find someone in a bedsheet at the Western Wall? Daniel asked about the treatment and recovery. I assume they do not just throw them in jail.
No, the Jerusalem police are actually very well trained for this. They deal with it so often that they can spot a Type 3 case from a block away. They are usually very gentle. They do not argue with the person. If someone says they are Jesus, the police do not say, "No, you are not." They say, "Okay, Jesus, let us go somewhere quiet where we can talk."
That is such a fascinating bit of specialized policing. They have to be part-time psychiatrists.
They really do. They usually take the person to Kfar Shawal, which is the mental health center I mentioned earlier. It is actually located on the side of an old village, and it is a very calm, green environment. The treatment for the pure Type 3 cases is surprisingly simple. They get them out of the old city.
Just physical distance?
Distance and normalcy. They give them some fluids, maybe a mild sedative to help them sleep, and they encourage them to talk to their family back home. Once they hear their spouse's voice or talk about their job back in Ohio, the terrestrial reality starts to reassert itself. The celestial image fades.
Do they use antipsychotics?
For Type 1 and Type 2, yes, because those are underlying conditions. But for the pure Type 3, doctors often avoid heavy medication. They find that once the person is out of the sacred zone of the city, the symptoms usually vanish within 5 to 7 days.
And then what? Do they just go back to their tour group and finish the holiday? Sorry I missed the bus yesterday. I thought I was John the Baptist, but I am back now. Let us go see the Dead Sea.
Actually, most of them are incredibly embarrassed. There is a huge amount of shame involved. They remember everything they said and did. They remember shouting on the street corner. They remember the bedsheet. Once the psychosis clears, they usually just want to go home immediately. They do not want to see another church or synagogue for a very long time.
I can imagine. It is like the ultimate what happens in Vegas moment, except it is what happens in Jerusalem, and it involves your eternal soul.
The recovery rate for Type 3 is actually 100%. They go back to their normal lives and they never have another episode. It is a completely isolated incident triggered by a specific place at a specific time.
That is actually quite hopeful. It means the brain is resilient. It can take a massive detour into another identity and then find its way back. But it makes me wonder about the locals Daniel mentioned. If you live here, you are constantly bathed in this intensity. Does it affect our collective psyche, even if we do not end up in Kefar Shaul?
I think it does. You see it in the politics, the way people talk about the city, the sense that every small event here has global significance. We all have a tiny bit of Jerusalem syndrome just by living here. We all feel the weight of the narrative. We just do not all wear bed sheets to express it.
It is like a low-grade fever that everyone in the city shares.
That is a perfect way to put it. And if you are enjoying our deep dives into the weirdness of our home city, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join our little community.
It really does. And you can always find our full archive of nearly 500 episodes at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered everything from urbanism in Vienna to the way our brains process fear, and you can search the whole feed there.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing Daniel asked about. He mentioned the idea of people thinking they are King David or Jesus, but is it ever modern figures? Like, does anyone ever think they are a modern political figure or a celebrity?
That is a great question. From what I've read, it is almost always biblical or ancient figures. You do not see people having a breakdown in Jerusalem and thinking they are Taylor Swift or Elon Musk.
Exactly. And that goes back to what we said about the software. The city triggers a specific set of archetypes that are buried deep in our cultural consciousness. It is like the city has a specific frequency, and it only vibrates with the ancient stories.
It is also interesting that the Messiah role is so common. There is something about Jerusalem that makes people feel like they have a mission to save the world. It is a city that demands a solution. Everyone who comes here feels like they have the answer to the city's problems. For some, that answer just happens to be that they are the savior.
It is the ultimate expression of the main character syndrome we see in modern culture, but amplified by 3,000 years of history.
So, what is the takeaway for our listeners? If you are planning a trip to Jerusalem, should you be worried?
Not at all. Just drink plenty of water, get some sleep, and maybe stay in a hotel that has very heavy bed sheets that are hard to turn into robes.
Good practical advice. And if you do start feeling the urge to preach on a street corner, maybe just start a podcast instead. It is a lot more socially acceptable in 2026.
Speak for yourself, Corn. Some days I think this podcast is my holy mission.
Easy there, Herman. Let us get you some water and a nap before you start looking at the laundry.
Fair enough. This has been a fascinating one. Thanks to Daniel for sending it in. It is always interesting to look at the city we live in through a psychiatric lens.
It really is. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We are on Spotify and at myweirdprompts.com. We will be back next week with another episode as we crawl toward our big 500th show.
Until then, stay grounded.
And keep your bedsheets on your bed. See ya.
Bye, everyone.
One last thing, Herman. Did you know there is a version of this for people who visit Mecca? It is sometimes called Mecca Syndrome, though it is much less studied in Western literature. It involves similar feelings of overwhelming spiritual responsibility.
That makes sense. Any place with that much concentrated spiritual energy is going to have similar effects. It is a human phenomenon, not just a Jerusalem one. We are wired for story, and sometimes the story just takes over.
A perfect note to end on. See you next time.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.